residents of Canadian County.
This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's Oral History Program Living Legends collection. This interview was originally done on June the 24th, 1971. The interview was conducted by Mr. James Katigan. The interviewee is Mrs. Grace Petree, that's Petree, of El Reno, Oklahoma. This interview is being re-recorded on August the 13th, 1985, for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener. There are a couple of minor sound problems on the master tape that could not be corrected in the recopying procedures. We have taken it exactly the way it appears on the reel-to-reel master tape.
On June the 24th, 1971, this is James Katigan with the Living Legend interviewing Mrs. Grace Petree, 1108 West Walnut, El Reno, residents of Canadian County. Mrs. Petree, would you relate some of your background by the way of opening this interview?
I was born in Storm Lake, Iowa in 1885 and lived there until I was 5 years old and went to school 1 year at a grade school there. My father sold that place and moved to South Dakota for 1 year, and I went to school 1 year in South Dakota. Then we came to Tecumseh, Nebraska, and went to school there for a while he came down here to look for a farmland in Indian Territory. He wanted to buy a relinquishment. He didn't make the run, but he found a relinquishment, and in 3 months' time he moved us to El Reno, and we lived there until he could take possession of the farm which he had bought which is now the west side of, which adjoins the west side of Calumet. I have lived here since we moved on the farm in May 1893, and I have lived in Canadian County every year since then, except 1908, when I married and lived 1 year in Enid. My husband had a job as a streetcar conductor. I married the late Charlie Petree, and then we lived there 1 year, and we moved back to Calumet. And I have lived here in Canadian County all my life since then. When I first came out on the farm, there was no roads, there was no section lines, and the old maids and old bachelors that had proved up on their farms and could sell their relinquishments, they had to build a one-room shanty, 1 or 2 room shanty, and dig a well. They had to stay so many nights on the farm during each month before they could sell out. And during that time, while we lived here in El Reno, and when we finally moved out there, why, a lot of people didn't know where to place their houses because there was no section lines, and a lot of them built right in what they thought was the middle of their farms. And today, we still see many of those farms with a house right in the center of the 160 that they first settled on. My folks, the first thing they tried to do was they all got together, well, let's see, a room house, and there was one room we didn't have any furniture in. We called it the empty room. Well, the missionaries and preachers and so forth that came through the country spotted the room and asked to have services there, and the services were held there, and they organized school districts, and they organized and the cattlemen fought the school districts. They had come there to raise cattle and not pay any taxes, and they wasn't going to have any schools. and they fought that tooth and nail. And there was just a few finally, and I can remember my mother, or Captain Todd and my father, they just worked day and night to get the school through. And he came up and said they were voting to on the school district and whether we should have school in Calumet or not. We had a little school building on the corner of my father's place, and so Captain Todd came up and said that my mother told my mother she had to go vote, and they like one vote. So she went. She was washing, and she took her sunbonnet off of a nail and took off her apron and wiped her hands on it and got in the little spring wagon, and he took her down there and voted and put the schoolhouse in Calumet. So then the school was moved to Calumet. We had before that, well, we had grade school in the little one-room schoolhouse that we'd had on the corner of my father's place, and they taught the grade subjects, which and when we had finished those, why they hired a teacher with more education that could teach us high school subjects. Well, he taught 1 year, Henry Kelly and his wife Grace, and then there was a family by the name of Louders bought out Bill Linley's farm or place, and they had put their son through college in Iowa, and they sent for him to come and teach the school so that his brothers and sisters could have high school subjects. So I had the benefit of 1 year's high school subjects out there in Kickerville school, and then the next year, why, he taught in Calumet, when the school was moved to Calumet on my mother's vote. And then the next year, why, Thomas Jackson, they hired him, and I finished up under him. And we had all high school subjects, algebra, Latin, and Ray's higher arithmetic, Miller's higher arithmetic, and physical geography, civil government, and so we really got a good education from those people that they brought their college work to us.
Mrs. Petree, will you give us your impression of the long ago, one-time, one-room schoolhouse?
Well, I don't know really how to tell that, but they were just a little square one-room schoolhouse. Some of them was 12 by 14, some of them 12 by 20, or depending on the children in the district, I think. But our little schoolhouse that we called Kickerville, they called it Kickerville because everybody was kicking. So we never knew who put up the sign and who named it. One morning we went down there, and on that new little one-room schoolhouse, there was a great big sign, Kickerville. And the only person that knew who put that sign up there was a woman that done it. And but the children that went on and finished the high school subjects under Tom Jackson in Calumet, most of them attended what we had a state teachers, or Canadian County Teachers Institute here at El Reno. It's normal, we'd call it now, but they called it an institute then. Professor Howell was the president, and Pearl Cruzan, he later married Arthur Snyder, was the secretary and treasurer. There was 131 teachers enrolled, and I'm presenting the museum a picture of the mural as it was in 1904 then. And
Mrs. Petree, you had quite a to-do in times gone by with the historical part of Canadian County. Would you relate some of those incidents to us?
Well, after I married, why, we bought a farm out northwest of Calumet, and I got to raising prize turkeys, and I won some Eddie ribbons and prizes on them. It created demand for them for all over the United States. Now the judges that came from all over the United States to judge turkeys here in Oklahoma, state fairs and so forth, recommended me to other state colleges and things like that. Well, finally, first thing I knew, I had sold turkey eggs every state in the union except Maine and Wyoming, and I sold right up against the borders of them. I also had orders from Cuba and Canada, sold eggs in Canada, and orders from Cuba and South America. But I didn't sell there because I was advised not to, on account of the international laws.
Mrs. Petree, is it not true that you also had inquiries about your turkeys from one of our most colorful governors?
Yes, I did. I had a letter from Governor Alfalfa Bill Murray, and he wrote me a very nice letter and commended me on my work and congratulated me. And I don't remember whether I sold him any eggs or not. I don't think I did, but anyhow, he wrote a very large hand, a large hand, and he wrote it with a lead pencil. I still have a letter someplace here, I know, but I couldn't tell you today just exactly where it's at. But I had letters from dignitaries all over in state colleges from every place nearly, and I was always so proud when they would tell me that they had won on their turkeys, and I never did compete against them in their state fairs, although they invited me to it. But I exchanged eggs with lots of prominent breeders, and I had Pekin, what they call Long Island Pekin ducks. Young ducks would weigh 12 pounds, where most average ducks would just weigh 4.5, if you know. Somebody's smoking.
Mrs. Petree, what brought you to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma?
Well, my parents brought me. I had no choice. I was 7 years old, and when we landed in Canadian County, and I don't know whether the county was named yet in the Canadian County or not, but it was just Indian Territory, El Rio. My parents my father was Scotch-Irish, and my mother was English and Dutch. And she was from Wisconsin. My father was from Iowa. And I was born in Storm Lake, Iowa in 1885, and lived there with my parents until I went 1 year to school. I was 5 years old in OneRoom School, old McKinnon School at Storm Lake, about 5 miles from Storm Lake town. And then my father sold that land and moved to Centerville, South Dakota, and we lived there for 1 year. I can't remember much about the year that I lived in South Dakota. We lived a quarter of a mile from a big artesian well. It was over 1,000 foot deep, and I know Papa had a sled made, and he had barrels, and we hauled water from that artesian well. But when I went to school, I was very bashful, and one little girl, she pushed me up the side of the post and stood me up there, and she took a hold of the other kids' hands and danced around me and said, "Gracie hasn't got a feller. Gracie hasn't got a feller." And so that's just about all I can remember about South Dakota, and then we came here to Indian Territory, in Canadian County. I was 7 years old that fall.
Mrs. Petree, give us some of what you remember back in your early days with your neighbors, and also people you associated with in Canadian County and El Reno.
possibly about 10 years old, 6 or 7 years old, 8 years old, I guess, when my folks boarded me out here in El Reno. There was no schools, of course. There hadn't been any school districts or anything organized out around in Canadian County then. And people boarded their children out here in El Reno, and I boarded with Mrs. Henderson. She had lost her husband out there. He had died by typhoid fever, and she came down to school here in El Reno, and the folks were neighbored with them, and they boarded me with her. And Etta Dale was my teacher. I went to early school, attended the 5th grade B. My seatmate was Gertrude Riley, and later, and let's see. When I was after 1904, I taught school in 1904, and then after that I clerked in a store for 3 years at Calumet, and then I come to El Reno in 1907 and was clerking at Penner and Dale in Montgomery's General Dry Goods store. Penner and Dale had a men's store, and I was married that fall to Charlie Petree, and he had a job on a streetcar conductor in Enid. We moved up there, and later the next year we moved back to Calumet, and my first child was born, R.L. Petree. He now lives at Lincoln, Nebraska, and 3 years later we bought a farm over in the big pasture, and my daughter was born there, Miss Chet Smith. She now lives here 9 miles west of El Reno, and I just had the 2 children. I have 2 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. And
Mrs. Petree, have you lived in any other county in Oklahoma besides Canadian County?
one year, the years I was married, I lived 1 year in Enid, Oklahoma, Garfield County. And since that time, I've lived the rest of my life in Canadian County. My children was born here, I was married here, and expect to die here.
Mrs. Petree, do you have a few memories of your immediate family, like, for instance, your granddaughters?
I sure do. I have 2 granddaughters. The oldest one is my son's daughter. She lives in Denver, Colorado. Her mother died when she was 12 years old, and she went to live with her father in Lincoln, Nebraska then, and she was majorette in the band in high school. Otherwise, about her sports and things, I do not know. But my other granddaughter, Ramona Dean Bond, her was Ramona Dean Smith, and she has competed. She lost her arm when she was 8, her right arm at the shoulder almost, when she was 8 years old. But she has competed in all kinds of sports: baseball, tennis, and golf, bowling, and various others. She has won many honors in golf, and then this last week had won the 2nd place at Warm Spring, Georgia, in amputees women's tournament, and the third all-around championship player, and let's see, second place, and there's something else she won. I can't picture. Did we ever saw it?
Mrs. Crowley, Mrs. Petree, when your parents, the Crowleys, moved from El Reno to the farm, there's a story about the empty room. Could you relate all the experiences and what this empty room was for this part of the country?
You're asking an awful big job, because everything that happened to the community took place as argued over and discussed and cussed and discussed in that empty room. But one last thing, I don't remember people quarreling. The only fussing about was down probably factional people like the cattlemen and things like that that didn't want any improvements or taxes or anything. People that thought that. But the missionaries, our empty room, we didn't have any furniture in it, and the missionaries came through the country and they'd stop and talk to us and ask permission to preach and maybe stay 2 or 3 days and rest their teams, but most of them come in spring wagons and something like that, had some bedding with them. And they visited around the neighbors, married people, married young couples, and we had no doctors, but we could go over to Fort Rio and consult the Army doctors at Fort Rio. And my father used to go over there, and they would tell him what to do, and he'd come home and take care of us. Only once did we have to have doctors come out to the farm. One of my brothers got hurt, and Papa took him over there, and they had us, told him to go home and put on all the boiling water he could put on. They filled boilers and tubs and reservoirs and everything with hot water, and they came out and operated on my brother that afternoon. And they put him on the dining table. Mama got out her clean sheets and everything, but he got all right. But the doctors couldn't go out but we could go to the doctors over to Fort Rio, which they couldn't come to us. And the school districts is organized why they met in that empty room and discussed them, and they named the town, when they named the post office, or when the stagecoach went west. They finally sent the mail out on the stagecoach as far west from El Reno to Arapahoe. We hadn't been getting our mail at El Reno. And they sent it out to stagecoach by stagecoach to Calumet, and then the woman that had been taking care of the mail there, she was from Boston. She lived a mile south of my folks. And they decided on the name Calumet because it meant peace with the Indians, and everybody wanted peace with the Indians. But then after the railroad went through and the town of Calumet was built, the town there, they named the town Calumet because they didn't want to change their mailing address from Calumet. Of course,
Mrs. Petree, when your mother's vote on the OneRoom Schoolhouse to change the school to the Calumet School, what happened to all the activities that were taking place in this one-room school?
Well, we had no place in because the one room, the empty room wasn't empty anymore, and so they moved the depot agent. They had the railroad had went through, and the depot was built new, and the depot agent was very religious, and he said that he would take care of the Sunday school and church and what activities we had in the depot. And so all the activities, those church activities, things just moved to the depot for a period of time.
Mrs. Petree, can you tell us something about the history of the churches, what they had to do in those days, in around 1922, during the big North Canadian floods?
The quite a few evangelists were holding meetings, and I can't remember just exactly the first one, but there was an auctioneer, but he called himself Colonel Gotelius. He was a converted auctioneer here in El Reno, and he went out to many schoolhouses and things like that, and held meetings. And then there was a Nazarene preacher that held meetings up and down the north side of the river. We couldn't get to Calumet or any place, and we had to go clear around to clear around, I forget where to go to. Well, clear down on 81 to get to El Reno even. And so we were entirely cut off. But we had tent meetings and schoolhouse meetings and things like that, and there were many people converted. And it left a trail. Well, I'm getting ahead of my story. We held meetings in schoolhouses, the Mountain View Schoolhouse, and Lone Star, and Center Grove, and just any place. And then we put up big tent meetings, and we had tent meetings all up and down the river for 2 years because we couldn't cross the river to get to church anyplace else. Well, there was many converts, and they were left without a church. And so when this Nazarene preacher left, they were 60. He turned into the Methodist Church at Calumet, and the pastor was Reverend Simmons. And but later on, these people got together, and all of that church was organized, and it's still going over there. And the Coleman Chapel Church is still going, or Center Grove. And the Assembly of God Church is also one of the churches that sprang from these meetings. And another church up towards the north side of Gary there someplace. And I don't know the name of it. That's all.
Mrs. Petree, what do you remember about the Cheyenne and the Arapaho Indians in the early days?
They were very peaceful around in our neighborhood, and there was only one uprising that I ever saw or remember of. We had report of, and that was out at Arapaho, and my aunt lived out there, and some Indian had got drunk, or fellow got drunk, and he got in a fight with an Indian out there, and I guess they thought they were all going to get killed anyhow. The settlers all got their women folks into their half dugouts, and most of them had half dugouts out there because that land out there was gyp rock, and they half rock and half dirt, and half rock underground and half it was a kind of a, it wasn't a dugout, but it was half rock and half dirt, and they got the women folks all in there and surrounded them and everything, and they sent for the soldiers. They had a runner, and he came to our house, and I don't know how far they'd run those horses, but they had stationed someplace that a runner would pick up a fresh horse, and they'd run it as far as he could, and then he'd tell people along the way that settlers along the way met him, the uprising, and he made his way to Fort Ring, and he stopped at our house, and later on, about an hour or so later, we saw them go, the cavalry go across the prairie, galloped across the prairie with their bow suits and bayonets shining and going west as fast as the horses could take them. That it turned out not to be an uprising after all. This fellow just got drunk and he covered up, and there was no uprising.
We have just had a pleasant interview with Mrs. Grace Petree, who on her next birthday will be 86. Your interviewer has been James Katigan for the Living Legend Library of the Oklahoma Christian College. This interview was made at the new Canadian County Historical Society for the state of Oklahoma. It is located in the Old Rock Island Depot in the city of El Reno, Oklahoma.